It's funny how things can look perfect on the outside, but you know deep down that the cracks are already there, waiting to show. That's exactly where I was. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the leaves had started to change, falling in a cascade of colors across the town. There's something about that time of year that always feels like a fresh start. Isn't there? Like, no matter how bad things get, the world keeps turning, and everything changes. But that wasn't what I was thinking about that morning. I'd woken up in my small apartment, in a building that could have been mistaken for a time capsule from the 90s, nothing fancy, but it worked. The coffee was brewing. My mind was already running 100 miles per hour, and there was no turning it off. The phone call from the night before still echoed in my mind. "Tommy, it's your brother. I need you to come home. We've got a problem." My brother, Evan. Always in the thick of it. I should have known when he called, his voice shaky, urgent. The kind of voice you hear when someone's holding a bomb in their hands and they're hoping you'll help defuse it before it blows up. And man, I couldn't ignore that call. Not when it came from him. Evan had always been the wild card of our family. Growing up, he was the kind of guy who always seemed to be in some kind of trouble, whether it was with the law, women, or just life in general. I was the opposite. Straight-laced, got the job, paid the bills on time, kept to myself. But we made it work. Family's family, right? I looked at the clock on my nightstand. It was already pushing noon, and I had to get on the road. I grabbed my jacket, threw on my boots, and walked out the door. The car was parked out front, a rusty old thing that had seen better days, but it got me from point A to point B. Nothing fancy. The drive back to the small town we grew up in was quieter than usual. The radio didn't even seem to help this time. Just the hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional screech of a passing truck. As I drove, my mind kept drifting back to that phone call. Evan said the problem was big. And whatever it was, it sounded like he had gotten himself tangled up in something even worse than usual. I'd dealt with his messes before, but there was always that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. What if this time was the one that went too far? What if this time he couldn't be saved? I pulled into the driveway of our old family house. It hadn't changed much since we were kids. Still the same yellow siding, the same big oak tree in the front yard. It almost felt like I was stepping back in time. The front door creaked open as Evan appeared on the porch, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. His face was pale, eyes wide like he hadn't slept in days. "You finally made it," he said, his voice a little rough, like he hadn't had a real conversation in a while. "What's going on, Evan?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "You sounded like you were about to collapse on the phone." Evan nodded, pulling me inside. "I'm in deep this time, Tom. Real deep. And I need your help." Inside, the house was dark, as if it hadn't seen sunlight in ages. The old wooden floors creaked underfoot, and I could feel the weight of years pressing down on me. Everything here held a memory. Some good, some bad, but all of them tangled up in this place. Evan sat down on the old couch in the living room, looking like he was about to break. "It's about Claire," he finally muttered. She's been seeing someone else." I froze. Claire. His wife. The one constant in his life for the past few years. The one thing I thought he could count on. The woman he promised was the love of his life. "Are you serious?" I asked, trying to process the words he just dropped on me. He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "Yeah. I found out yesterday. I followed her. She's been sneaking around with this guy, and I don't know what to do, man." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I had a lot of questions, but one stood out more than the others. "How did you find out?" I asked, my voice quieter now, trying not to let the anger seep through. He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "I saw them together, at the park of all places. She didn't even see me." My heart sank. Evan wasn't the kind of guy who usually went digging into his partner's business. He was the type to brush things off, bury his feelings, and move on. But this was different. This was betrayal on a level I hadn't seen before. "What are you going to do about it?" I asked, leaning back against the wall. "I don't know, man," he admitted, running his hands over his face in frustration. "I don't want to lose her, but I can't just act like nothing happened. She's been lying to me for months. I just need to know if it's really over between us or if this is just some fling. I sat down next to him, my mind racing. I didn't want to be the one to tell him what I was thinking, but I had to say it. Evan, sometimes people don't change. Maybe it's time to face the truth. Maybe this isn't just a fling. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. I know, Tom. I know. But I can't just walk away from everything we've built together. I can't let this be the end. I could see the pain in his eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But I knew deep down that this wasn't just about Claire anymore. It was about something bigger. The lies, the deception, the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't just his marriage that was on the line now. It was his entire life. I'll help you figure this out, I said, finally breaking the silence. But you need to be ready for whatever comes next. You can't keep going back and forth on this. You have to face what's happening. Evan nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. I just don't know what to do anymore, Tom. I'm lost. I looked at him, seeing the same man I'd always known. Flawed, but trying. And for some reason, I couldn't just walk away. Maybe it was because we were brothers, or maybe because I knew the pain he was feeling. Either way, I knew I was in this with him. But what neither of us knew was how deep the betrayal ran, or how far this would all go. I stood up and grabbed my coat, throwing it over my shoulder. Let's go for a drive. Clear your head. We'll figure it out. Evan didn't argue. He just stood up, following me out the door. As we got in the car and drove off down the familiar roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to dive into something darker than either of us could have imagined. Evan's car hummed steadily as we drove through the familiar streets of our hometown, a place that, despite all its quaint charm, felt increasingly suffocating the longer we stayed away. It was hard to ignore the weight of the conversation hanging between us, the questions that hadn't been asked yet. Was Claire's affair something Evan could forgive, or was this the end of the road? We were both caught in that limbo, unsure how to proceed, but we knew we couldn't keep running from the truth. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd left town like me? Evan asked, breaking the silence. I shot him a look. What do you mean? I mean, you went off, built a life for yourself, got away from all this. You're not tied down to the same stuff we are, he said, his eyes on the road. Sometimes I wonder if I'd be better off not having come back. The question stung more than I expected. I'd never really considered how my leaving might have impacted him. Sure, I'd moved on, but I'd always assumed Evan would be right there with me, finding his own way. In many ways, I think he felt like I had abandoned him. But the reality was, Evan had always been the one to stay in the thick of it, and I'd left because I couldn't keep watching him fall deeper into his messes. You know I didn't leave you, right? I said quietly. You've always had a way of digging yourself out. I couldn't keep putting myself in the middle of it all. Evan didn't respond right away. He just kept driving, his face set in that expression of someone who's learned how to hide what they really feel. We drove past the old park where I used to hang out with the guys, the one where Evan said he saw Claire with this other guy. I could feel the tension rising in my chest. The image of her with another man was something Evan couldn't shake, and frankly, neither could I. But right now, it wasn't just about Claire. It was about what came next. What was he going to do? What was I going to do? We pulled up to a small cafe on the edge of town. The kind of place where you could still hear the clink of a spoon against a coffee cup and the soft hum of small-town gossip. Evan parked, but neither of us moved for a second. We were both thinking, maybe wishing that the right words would come out. Finally, Evan spoke. I don't know if I can fix this, Tom, he admitted. I've been thinking about it all night, and it just doesn't feel right anymore. I don't think I can trust her again. The confession hit me harder than I expected. But I understood. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. And Claire's actions had made it clear she wasn't as invested in this relationship as Evan was. Maybe it's time to let it go, then, I said, the words coming out in a way that almost felt like I was speaking to myself more than him. You can't keep living in a relationship that isn't what you thought it was. You deserve better than that. Evan looked out the window, his jaw clenched tight. I just don't know how to walk away. Everything we've built. It's all tangled up in this. He was right about one thing. Leaving wasn't as simple as just walking out the door. Evan had built his life around Claire. They had a house together, friends, a routine. But sometimes the hardest thing to do is walk away from the life you've made. We sat in silence for a moment, just letting the weight of the conversation hang between us. Finally, Evan broke the silence. "I need to talk to her. I need to hear it from her," he said, his voice firm. "I need to know if she's really done with me, if this is just a phase or if we're really finished." I nodded slowly. "I get it, but don't do anything you'll regret. You've got to be prepared for whatever she says." "Yeah," he muttered. "I guess I've been preparing for the worst." The thing about people like Evan is, they never know when to stop. He was caught in this loop of hope and despair, thinking maybe Claire would change, but the truth was already right in front of him. Still, I knew that until he had that final conversation with her, he wouldn't be able to move on. He needed closure, even if it meant facing the brutal truth. The following day, Evan found himself sitting across from Claire in their living room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. I had offered to be there, but he insisted that this was something he had to do on his own. I couldn't argue with that. Besides, I knew that whatever happened, Evan would need to deal with it in his own way. I spent most of the day pacing my apartment, trying to distract myself with work. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts kept drifting back to Evan, to the conversation we'd had, and the one he was having with Claire. What if she said it was over? What if she didn't care anymore? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I couldn't step in and fix it. Around late afternoon, Evan called me. His voice was different, quieter, the kind of quiet that spoke volumes. "Tom, it's over," he said, the words coming out like he'd just let go of something heavy. She admitted it. She's been seeing him for months. I wasn't sure what to say at first. There was no comforting someone in this situation. No easy fix. The damage was done. But I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief for Evan. Maybe it was the closure he needed. "I'm sorry, man," I said, "but you're going to get through this. It might not feel like it now, but you will." He didn't respond right away, but I could hear him breathing deeply on the other end of the line. After a long pause, he finally spoke again. "I need a drink." And just like that, I knew what was coming next. The familiar escape. The same escape he'd always turned to in times of pain, alcohol. "Don't do anything stupid, all right?" I warned. "You're better than this." Yeah, he muttered. "I'll be fine. I just need some time to think." I wanted to believe him, but I knew how Evan worked. When things got hard, he'd retreat. Drink. Pretend like everything was fine. It was his way of dealing with the fallout. Still, I wasn't about to leave him to drown in it. "I'll meet you at the bar," I said. "Give you some company. Maybe talk this out." Evan didn't argue. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the offer. It was just that he knew he couldn't sit in his feelings for too long. He needed to numb them. As I hung up, I couldn't help but think that this was just the beginning. Sure, Evan had his closure, but that didn't mean the story was over. There was more to come, and I had a feeling things were going to get a lot more complicated before they got better. Before we get deeper into Evan's spiral and the next part of the story, don't forget to hit that like button, share, and comment below if you're enjoying the ride so far. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next part of the story. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The bar was quiet when I walked in. Too quiet, really, for a Friday night. The only sound was the low hum of the jukebox playing some old rock song no one really cared about. The usual crowd was there. Regulars all nursing their drinks, exchanging small talk like they had for years. But even the chatter felt distant, like everyone knew something was about to crack wide open, but no one was willing to say it aloud. Evan was sitting at the far end, leaning on the bar, staring into his drink like it was the only thing that could make sense of the chaos that had taken over his life. When I slid onto the stool next to him, he didn't look up. He didn't need to. I knew exactly what kind of space he was in right now. The kind of space where you're not sure whether you want to drink to forget or drink to keep feeling. "Guess you weren't kidding when you said you needed a drink," I said, trying to lighten the mood. He half smiled. the corners of his mouth twitching as if the smile didn't quite fit anymore. "Yeah, well, you were right about one thing," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the noise of the bar. "I needed to hear it from her. And now that I don't know what to do with myself." I let the silence stretch out between us. There was nothing to say. I had my own thoughts about the situation, about Claire, about Evan, but right now all I could do was be there. That was all I had to offer him. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked, leaning in a little closer. Evan shook his head. "I don't even know where to start." He took a long sip from his glass, his eyes far off. "She says she's been seeing him for months. It's not just some one-time thing, Tom. She's been lying to me for so long. I don't even know who she is anymore." That hit harder than anything, because I knew Evan. I knew how much he had invested in his relationship with Claire. She had been his rock, his escape from everything else that had gone wrong in his life. And now, she was just another lie he had to swallow. I sat back in my chair, rubbing the back of my neck. "You know, there's no easy fix for this. You've got to let it play out. If she's done, then you've got to be done too." Evan's eyes flickered up to meet mine. "It's not that simple. You don't understand, Tom. We had plans. We were going to build a life together, you know?" I knew exactly what he meant. But sometimes the plans we build in our heads aren't the ones that end up happening. And sometimes they fall apart in ways that feel like they were destined to fail from the start. But I wasn't going to tell him that right now. Not when he was this raw. "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you," I said, leaning forward. "But maybe this is the best thing that could happen to you in the long run. Maybe now you can finally get the closure you need. Maybe it's time to stop holding on to something that was already slipping away." Evan's eyes clouded with a mix of anger and sadness. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just going to end up alone. And this whole town's going to remember me as the guy who couldn't even hold on to his own marriage." I let the words sink in, but I didn't have an answer. There was no easy fix for heartbreak, no magic solution to undo what had already been done. All I could do was be here when he needed someone to listen. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The night dragged on, and the tension between Evan and Claire hung thick in the air. Every drink he took seemed to bring him closer to that breaking point. I knew he wanted to do something reckless, to lash out, maybe to find some kind of way to make it all right again. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't something you could fix with anger or revenge. This was something he had to face head-on, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning, I found myself pacing the living room, my phone in my hand. The thing was, Evan's mess wasn't just his anymore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that everything was about to unravel. Claire's affair was just the tip of the iceberg. This whole situation had deeper roots, and it wasn't just Evan who was going to feel the consequences. I hadn't heard from Evan all morning, and I was starting to get that uneasy feeling in my gut. When I heard the knock on the door, I wasn't surprised. I opened it to find him standing there, looking disheveled, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice trembling. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. I could feel the weight of what was about to unfold, but I didn't know what was coming next. We sat on the couch, the air thick with tension. Evan didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists. "Evan, what happened?" I asked gently. "I went to see him," he said, barely able to meet my eyes. "I confronted him." I froze. "What do you mean, you confronted him?" He took a shaky breath. "I went to the park where I saw them together. I found him, and I told him everything. I told him to stay the hell away from Claire." I sat back, processing what he had just said. "Evan, you can't just go around confronting people like that. What were you thinking?" "I wasn't thinking," he said bitterly. "I was angry. I just needed to know who this guy was, what he had with her. And I needed to know why she couldn't just tell me the truth." I shook my head. "This isn't going to fix anything, man. You can't solve this with your fists or words." "I know," he muttered. But when I looked into his eyes, I realized something. He wasn't just some random guy she was seeing. He was connected to something bigger. Something I never saw coming. I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Evan hesitated for a moment, his face pale. This guy, he's part of something that goes way beyond Claire and me. I found out he's got ties to some pretty dangerous people. I don't know how far this goes, but I think Claire was involved in something bigger than an affair. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a love triangle. There was something darker lurking beneath the surface, and Claire had dragged Evan into it without him even realizing. I took a deep breath. We need to figure this out, Evan. This isn't just about your marriage anymore. This is about something bigger, and you don't want to get caught up in it. Evan nodded slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. I don't know who to trust anymore, Tom. I don't even know if I can trust myself. I put my hand on his shoulder. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. We didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The stakes were higher now, and the game was about to change. I could feel the tension building. The calm before the storm was over. The storm was here. The next few days were a blur. Evan didn't leave his house. He barely answered his phone. I called him a couple of times, but every time it went straight to voicemail. I knew he was spiraling, and I couldn't pull him back until he was ready. But there was something else gnawing at me, something I hadn't told him yet. I knew that Claire's affair wasn't the only thing tearing him apart. The moment he mentioned the guy's ties to something bigger, I realized the true danger we were all in. This wasn't just about Evan's broken heart. This was about something dark and dangerous, and we were all in way too deep. I hadn't heard from Claire either, not since the night Evan confronted her. Part of me wanted to go over to her place and demand answers, but I knew that wasn't the move. This had to be handled carefully. If what Evan was saying was true, if Claire was involved with people who were capable of far more than just infidelity, then I couldn't just jump into the fire without knowing who or what I was dealing with. I spent the next couple of days doing my own digging, talking to old contacts, trying to piece together the mystery surrounding Claire and her mysterious lover. What I uncovered made my stomach turn. The guy wasn't just some random affair partner. He was involved in some shady business, things I didn't even want to get into. But one thing was clear. Claire had gotten herself involved with people who weren't afraid to hurt anyone who stood in their way. And that included Evan, whether she realized it or not. I knew I had to act fast. I went over to Evan's house late that evening. I didn't bother knocking. I knew he wouldn't answer anyway. I just let myself in. He was sitting on the couch, staring at the wall like he'd been there for hours. Evan? I said, my voice firm, trying to break through the fog that seemed to surround him. We need to talk. He didn't respond at first, but then slowly turned to face me. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn, like he hadn't been sleeping. But even in his state, I could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. I know what you're thinking, I said, sitting down across from him. You're thinking you can just close yourself off and wait for this to blow over. But that's not going to happen. This is bigger than just you and Claire. There are people involved who will not let this go. And if we don't do something now, you're going to get caught in the crossfire. Evan's eyes flickered with a mixture of anger and fear. What are you talking about? I leaned forward, making sure I had his full attention. Claire's not just dealing with some guy on the side. The guy she's been seeing is tied up in something dangerous, something illegal. And now you're in the middle of it. His face went pale. What do you mean? I've been doing some digging, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This guy, the one she's been with, he's involved with some pretty shady people. Drug deals, money laundering, you name it. And if Claire's involved with him, that means she's not just betraying you. She's putting you and everyone around her in danger. Evan didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me, processing the information. And for the first time in days, I saw something flicker in his eyes, something like clarity. What do I do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. We need to get you out of this, I said. You need to distance yourself from Claire, and you need to get away from these people before they make you a target. And we need to do it fast. Evan's face hardened. You think I don't know that? You think I don't want to walk away from her? I can't do this alone. I don't know how to fix this. You don't have to fix anything, I said, trying to calm him down. But you have to face the reality. Claire's not the woman you thought she was. She's not the person you fell in love with. And the longer you stay in this, the harder it's going to be to get out. Evan sat back, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if I can just let her go. I love her, Tom. I can't just throw it all away. I get it, I said, my voice softer now. But you can't keep loving someone who's already made their choice. Claire chose to betray you. She chose this guy. And now it's time for you to choose you. You deserve better than this. He nodded slowly, his face hardening again as he looked down at his hands. You're right, he said, his voice quieter now. I can't keep doing this. I have to walk away. I have to. The air in the room shifted. There was a sense of finality in his words, like a door closing behind him. For the first time in days, I saw a flicker of the old Evan. The one who was ready to fight, ready to stand up for himself. But that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. Walking away from Claire was just the first step. But the people she was involved with, these dangerous people, weren't going to let Evan go that easily. No matter how much he wanted to distance himself from them, they weren't going to let him slip through their fingers without a fight. The following night, things took a sharp turn. I was at home, flipping through some old case files I'd been working on for a private investigation job, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Evan. They're coming after me. The blood ran cold in my veins. I didn't even need to ask who they were. I grabbed my jacket, grabbed my keys, and rushed out the door. I knew where I had to go. I pulled up to Evan's house to find the front door wide open. I could hear voices inside, muffled and urgent, and then gunshots. 3 quick, sharp cracks that made my heart stop in my chest. Without thinking, I bolted inside, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I wasn't about to let Evan go down without a fight. Inside, the scene was chaos. Evan was on the floor, bleeding from a wound in his side, a gun clutched tightly in his hand. 2 men stood over him, one of them pointing a gun at his head, the other rummaging through the house, looking for something. I didn't hesitate. I ran forward, knocking the gun out of the man's hand, sending him stumbling back. The other one turned, but I was already on him, knocking him to the ground with a single punch. The 2 men weren't prepared for the fight, and they were down within seconds. But that wasn't the end of it. As I pulled Evan to his feet, his face pale and sweating with pain, I knew we had to get out of there. The men weren't just going to leave us alone. They were going to keep coming after us, after him, until they got what they wanted. Evan looked up at me, blood dripping from his mouth. We need to go. Now. I helped him to the door, knowing that once we stepped out, nothing would be the same. The storm had arrived, and we were right in the middle of it. We ran. I didn't have a plan, I didn't know where we were going, but I knew we couldn't stay. The men we'd taken down weren't the only ones after Evan. They were just the beginning. We had to leave town, get somewhere safe and fast. I helped Evan stagger to the car, his body heavy with pain, but there was no time to waste. He was still bleeding, and I knew we had to patch him up before he bled out. The sound of sirens in the distance only made me move faster. I don't know what to do, Tom, Evan gasped as I slammed the door shut. This wasn't supposed to happen. I just wanted to end things with Claire. His words hit me like a slap, but there was no time to feel sorry for him now. The stakes had changed. We weren't just dealing with a broken heart anymore. We were fighting for survival. You need to keep your head straight, Evan, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even as I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. We're not done yet. We've got to make it through this. All right? He nodded weakly, clutching his side as I slammed the car into gear and sped off down the road. The town we grew up in was behind us now, the familiar roads and buildings fading into the distance as we headed for the outskirts. I didn't know where we were going, but I knew we couldn't stay anywhere near the house. The tension between us was palpable. Evan had always been the kind of guy to brush things off, to pretend that everything would work out in the end. But now I could see the fear in his eyes, the fear that he wasn't going to make it out of this. And I couldn't blame him. This wasn't just some bad breakup anymore. This was real danger, real threats, and a situation that could spiral out of control faster than we could handle it. We were caught in a web that Claire had spun, and now we were paying the price for her mistakes. "I can't believe she did this," Evan muttered under his breath, looking out the window as the scenery blurred by. "She put me in this mess. She got us both involved with these people." I glanced over at him, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Claire wasn't the only one involved here, Evan," I said quietly. "You made the choice to stay with her. I'm not saying it's your fault, but don't act like she was the only one who got you into this." Evan flinched, the words hitting harder than I intended. But the truth was the truth. He had spent months pretending like everything was fine, like the warning signs didn't exist. He had turned a blind eye to the red flags, and now we were both paying for it. We drove for what felt like hours, heading into the mountains to put as much distance between us and the town as possible. The only light in the night came from the headlights of the car, casting long shadows on the road ahead. "You know, I thought I was done with all this," Evan said, breaking the silence again. "I thought once I left the town, I'd be able to leave all the mess behind. But now, it's like it's all catching up to me." I understood what he meant. He'd spent so long running from his past, from the mistakes he had made, that he hadn't realized how deep the hole had gotten. And now we were both trapped in the consequences of those choices. But there was no turning back. I didn't want to think about what would happen if we didn't make it out of this. What Claire's involvement with these dangerous people would mean for Evan, and for me. But I couldn't help but feel like we were heading straight toward a storm that was bigger than anything we'd ever faced. Evan's voice broke through my thoughts. "Do you think they'll stop coming after me? Do you think if we get away, it'll all be over?" I didn't answer right away. Truth was, I wasn't sure. But I couldn't tell him that. Not now, not when he was already hanging by a thread. "We just have to keep moving," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "As long as we keep our heads down, we can figure out a way to make it stop." The car slowed as we reached a small, run-down motel on the side of the road. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly light over the parking lot. I pulled in, not really caring about the state of the place, just needing somewhere to lay low for a while. "Stay here," I said, looking over at Evan. "I'm going to find us something to patch you up." He nodded, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He didn't want to be a burden. He wanted to be strong, but this wasn't the time for that. This was the time for action. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the motel's front office. As I passed the window, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I looked over my shoulder, but there was no one around. Still, the sense of being hunted stuck with me. When I returned with a first aid kit, Evan was sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes glued to the window. The tension was thick in the air as I went to work, cleaning the wound and dressing it as best as I could. "I'm sorry," Evan said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. "For all of this, for dragging you into it. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I paused, looking at him as I finished wrapping his side. "You didn't drag me into anything. I'm here because you're my brother. That's what family does." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes full of guilt. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he muttered. "You don't have to worry about that," I said, forcing a smile. "We've got each other's backs. That's all that matters right now." We both fell silent as the weight of the situation settled back in. I could hear the faint sound of a car engine in the distance, but it was hard to tell if it was coming closer. Felt like the calm before the storm. Just as I finished checking the door locks, I heard the sound of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot. I froze. It was too late to leave now, and we couldn't afford to run again. There was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know who it was, whether it was someone coming to help or someone coming to finish what those men had started. I looked over at Evan, who was wide-eyed, trying to keep calm despite the fear that was flooding his veins. I motioned for him to stay down, then moved silently toward the door. I looked through the peephole and saw a familiar face. It was Claire. I stood frozen, staring at the peephole. My pulse quickened. a cold sweat forming on my skin as the seconds stretched on. Claire was standing on the other side of the door, her face tense and wary. She was alone, but I didn't trust that for a second. I had seen the kind of people she was involved with, and I knew they wouldn't hesitate to come after us again. But here she was, standing outside, looking like she had nowhere else to turn. I glanced over at Evan, who was sitting on the bed, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. He didn't know what to make of it either. This wasn't how he'd imagined the confrontation going. He had hoped to leave Claire behind, to walk away from everything that had dragged him down. But now it was like she was pulling him back in, one step at a time. "What should I do?" Evan whispered, his voice shaky. "I didn't expect her to show up here, not after everything." I hesitated, my hand still on the doorknob. This was a moment I had been dreading, a moment where things could either be set right or spiral completely out of control. "Stay here," I said quietly, my mind racing. "Let me handle this. I'll talk to her. But you need to stay low." Evan nodded, and I could see the mixture of emotions in his eyes. Confusion, anger, maybe even a bit of hope. He didn't want this to be the end. He didn't want to believe that Claire was as deep into this mess as we'd discovered. But the truth was right in front of him. I could see him grappling with that internal struggle, not sure if he was ready to accept it. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. Then I opened the door. Claire stood there, her expression guarded but with something softer behind her eyes. She didn't look like the woman I remembered. There was a weariness about her, a heaviness that told me this wasn't a simple plea for reconciliation. This was desperation. "Tom," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, can we talk?" I stepped back slightly, not letting her in but not slamming the door in her face either. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but this wasn't it. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about, Claire," I said, my voice steady but cold. "You've done enough damage already. It's too late for apologies." Her eyes flickered with pain, but she didn't back down. "No, it's not like that. You don't understand. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know how deep I was getting into this until it was too late. You have to believe me." I looked past her for a second, scanning the parking lot, making sure no one else was lurking nearby. "I don't know what game you're playing, Claire, but I'm not buying it." Her face hardened, the softness in her eyes replaced with a steely resolve. "I don't care if you believe me or not. I'm here because I'm in over my head, and I need help. Evan's life is in danger. Yours too." That hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been waiting for the moment when Claire finally admitted how bad it had gotten, but hearing it out loud, hearing the desperation in her voice, it changed everything. "What the hell do you mean, his life is in danger?" I demanded, stepping closer to the door, my voice low and dangerous. "What did you get him into, Claire?" She looked around nervously before meeting my eyes. "There's a man, a dangerous man, who's been working with the people I got involved with. He's been watching Evan, watching both of you, and now he wants something from him. I don't know what it is, but it's not good." I felt the floor drop out from under me. This wasn't just about a broken relationship anymore. This was about survival. "You need to leave," I said, my voice tight. "Get out of here. We're done with you. You've dragged us into this mess for too long." "I can't leave," she said quickly, her voice rising in panic. "You don't understand. They're already here. They're looking for you, looking for both of you. And if they find you, it's over. They'll kill you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. My mind was racing now, the plan I'd been trying to put together suddenly useless. It didn't matter if I wanted to end things with Claire, if I wanted to walk away. This wasn't just about a messy breakup anymore. This was about life or death. I turned back to Evan, who was watching the scene unfold from the bed. His face was pale, his hand trembling as he clutched his side. I could see the fear in his eyes, but I could also see the resolve starting to build there. He wasn't going to let these people take him down without a fight. "Evan, we need to go," I said, my voice urgent. "Claire's right. These people aren't playing games. They'll come after us if we stay here." I know, Evan muttered, his voice rough. I just didn't know how far this had gone. How deep this really is. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I grabbed the first aid kit and some supplies, moving quickly as I tried to think ahead. There was no time to waste. We needed to get out of here, get somewhere safe. Somewhere they wouldn't find us. You're coming with us? I said to Claire, my voice harsh. If you want to survive this, you need to help us. But understand this. If you double-cross us, if you lead them right to us, there will be no second chances. Her face paled, but she nodded. I'm not trying to hurt you. She paused, swallowing hard. I just need to fix this. I don't want to lose him. Not after everything that's happened. I didn't know if I could trust her. I didn't know if she was just saying what she thought we wanted to hear. But right now, I didn't have much of a choice. Claire had been part of the problem, but right now, she could also be the solution. I turned to Evan, who was standing shakily by the window, glancing out into the darkness. We need to move fast. If they're looking for us, we can't stick around here much longer. Evan nodded, his jaw set. Where do we go? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I knew one thing, we weren't safe. Not yet. And every minute we stayed here was a minute closer to the storm breaking wide open. We had no choice but to run. Run until we couldn't run anymore. The door slammed behind us, and we moved into the night. The days that followed were a blur of running, hiding, and making desperate plans. We kept moving, never staying in one place for too long, always watching over our shoulders. Claire stayed with us, and I could see the guilt eating her alive, but she also knew that running was their only chance at survival. She wasn't the same person she'd been before. All of us had changed. The once confident woman I had known had been replaced by someone who, for the first time, seemed truly terrified. Evan wasn't much better. He was no longer the carefree guy who thought life was just a series of bad choices that could be laughed off. He had seen what true danger looked like now, and it had shattered him. He was quiet, withdrawn, but at the same time, there was a fierceness in him that I hadn't seen before. He wasn't just fighting for his own life anymore. He was fighting to make things right, even if it meant cutting the ties that had bound him to the people who had dragged him into this mess in the first place. But the hardest part wasn't running, it was the waiting for the other shoe to drop. I kept thinking that at any moment, the people Claire had been involved with would find us, that they'd track us down and it would all be over. The fear was constant, hanging over us like a dark cloud, but we held on to the hope that somehow we would find a way out of it. It was 3 days later when the storm finally broke. We were holed up in a cabin in the woods, a place I'd set up for situations like this. Remote, off the grid, no way for anyone to track us unless they knew exactly where we were. The sun had just started to set when Claire came to me, her face pale and her hands shaking. It's him, she whispered. He's coming. The man I told you about, he's finally found us. My heart dropped into my stomach. There it was, the moment I had been dreading. But I wasn't going to let fear take over now. Not after everything we had been through. I'm not letting them take you, Evan, I said, my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I couldn't just let this be the end. Evan looked at me with a mix of desperation and resolve. You don't have to protect me anymore. I messed up. I put us all in danger. But I'm not going to let them hurt you. Or Claire. I could see the shift in him then. This wasn't the same Evan who had been lost in the mess of his own emotions. This was someone who was ready to take responsibility for what he had done. Ready to stand up for himself, for Claire, and for me. We'll get out of this, I said, trying to reassure him, though I wasn't sure how. We'll make a plan. We always have. But then, just as we were about to make our move, the door slammed open. The figure standing in the doorway was unmistakable. Tall, muscular, and dressed in dark clothing. The man Claire had warned us about. I think you've all run far enough, the man said, his voice cold and unfeeling. You're not getting out of this. Not without consequences. My body tensed. This was it. This was the final showdown. But I wasn't about to let him intimidate us. Not after everything we'd been through. I'm not afraid of you, I said, stepping forward. "You've come a long way to find us, but you're too late. We're done running." The man chuckled darkly. "You think it's over, don't you? You think you're in control of this? You're not. This has only just begun." Before I could react, he moved quickly, pulling a gun from his waistband. My instincts kicked in, and I pushed Evan out of the way, grabbing hold of a chair and swinging it at the man with all my strength. The force of the impact knocked him off balance, and the gun went flying across the room. But we weren't safe yet. Evan, despite his injuries, lunged at the man, tackling him to the ground. It was a chaotic blur of movement as the two of them struggled, each trying to get the upper hand. But I could see the resolve in Evan's eyes now. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for redemption, for the chance to put things right. I ran to grab the gun, my hands shaking as I picked it up. It felt cold and heavy in my grip, but it gave me a sense of power I hadn't had before. Power to control the situation, power to protect the people I cared about. "Stay down," I warned, my voice barely audible. "This ends now." The man smirked up at me, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You think you've won? You think you're the ones in control? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I don't need to know anymore," I said, my voice steady. "I know enough." There was a beat of silence. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might make a move. But then I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The cavalry was coming. This was the final nail in the coffin for him. He cursed under his breath and tried to scramble to his feet, but Evan had already grabbed him by the collar, pulling him back to the floor. The moment the sirens grew louder, the man realized his time was up. "You're done," Evan spat, pushing the man back down. "You and your people won't hurt anyone again." The man gritted his teeth. "This isn't over. You can't run from us forever." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The police arrived moments later, and the man was quickly subdued, his future no longer in his hands. In the aftermath, things began to settle down. The police took the man into custody, and his connections were eventually exposed, unraveling the network of criminals who had been pulling the strings. Claire's involvement came to light, but the truth was complicated. She had been a victim in all of this, manipulated by people far more dangerous than she had realized. She agreed to testify, and while it wasn't an easy road for her, it was the first step toward redemption. As for Evan and me, we walked away from it all, changed but stronger. The weight of the past wasn't completely gone, but the future seemed a little brighter now. Evan had learned what it meant to take responsibility for his actions. He wasn't the same person who had been lost in the lies and deceit of the past. He was a man who was ready to move forward, to rebuild his life. And Claire? Well, her journey was just beginning. She would have to face the consequences of her involvement, but there was hope that she could make things right in her own way. For me, I'd learned something too, that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go, but it's the only way to move forward. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding peace. As I watched the sun rise over the horizon, I realized that the storm had passed. The chaos was behind us, and it was time to rebuild. One step at a time. Thanks for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. I can't wait to bring you more, so stay tuned for the next one.